I hadn't planned to be at work so late on Christmas Eve. It just sort of happened. The library, usually buzzing with quiet chatter and the faint tapping of keyboards, was eerily silent now. Everyone else had gone home hours ago, leaving me alone to finish the last few tasks that I couldn't justify putting off until after the holidays. The heater in the corner rattled faintly, pushing out warm air that didn't quite reach the drafty edges of the room. Outside, snowflakes drifted down in slow spirals, blanketing the streets and muffling any sound from the world beyond the windows. The street lamps cast long, orange-hued shadows that stretched across the empty parking lot. It was peaceful, I told myself. Quiet, but something about it didn't feel quite right. I pulled my cardigan tighter around me and checked my watch. 11:45 p.m. Just a few more minutes, I thought, and then I'd head home. But first, I had to finish reshelving the books stacked on the cart next to me. Fiction, non-fiction, biographies, children's stories. It was a task I'd done 100 times before, one I could do in my sleep if I had to. But tonight, it felt heavier somehow, like the air in the room was pressing down on me. I hummed softly to myself, an old habit to fill the silence, but even that didn't help. The sound seemed too loud, bouncing off the walls of the empty library. I stopped and listened, unsure of what I was expecting to hear. Nothing. Just the hum of the heater and the occasional groan of the old building settling into the cold. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. As I reached for the last book on the cart, a tattered copy of A Christmas Carol, I couldn't help but smile. Felt fitting for the night. I placed it back on the shelf, brushing a bit of dust from its spine, and turned to grab my coat. That's when I noticed it, the faintest sound, just at the edge of hearing. A melody, soft and lilting, like someone humming a Christmas carol. At first, I thought it might be coming from my own head, a leftover tune from earlier in the day. But it didn't stop. It grew clearer, more distinct. I froze, straining to hear it. The sound wasn't coming from inside the library. It was outside, beyond the frosted windows. I stepped closer, peering into the night, but all I saw was the snow-covered street, empty and still. The melody continued, a familiar tune I couldn't quite name, like it was just out of reach in my memory. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. Get a grip, I muttered to myself. It's Christmas Eve, and I've been here too long. I grabbed my bag and coat, determined to put the strange feeling behind me. But as I reached the library door, I hesitated. Something about the night felt off. The kind of off you can't put your finger on but can't ignore either. The carol, if that's what it was, faded, and for a moment I thought it had stopped altogether. But then it started again, a little louder this time, like it was moving closer. I tightened my grip on the door handle, heart pounding now. It wasn't fear exactly, just unease. Like the kind you feel when you're walking alone at night and hear footsteps behind you. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone there, but of course, I was still alone. The library felt colder suddenly, the warmth from the heater now a distant memory. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to shake it off. It's just the wind, I told myself. Or maybe someone on the next street playing music loud enough to carry through the stillness. Either way, it wasn't my concern. Couldn't be. The lights flickered briefly as I stepped out into the night. I shivered, pulling my coat tight against the cold. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I made my way to my car, and for a moment, the world seemed utterly silent again. But as I opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, there it was, the faint sound of carols, still playing somewhere in the distance. I didn't know why it unsettled me so much. After all, it's Christmas. Who wouldn't be playing carols on a night like this? But as I pulled out of the parking lot, I couldn't help but glance back at the library one last time. The windows glowed softly, their light spilling out onto the snow. For a second, I thought I saw a shadow move across one of them, but when I blinked, it was gone. I drove home that night with the melody still circling in my head. I wanted to let it go, to shrug it off as some odd little detail my tired mind was over-focusing on. Maybe a neighbor, I thought. Someone celebrating with their family late into the night. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The sound had followed me. Not literally, but close enough that I couldn't convince myself it wasn't important. The next morning, I arrived at the library feeling restless. The warmth of the day had softened the snow, leaving slushy puddles in the parking lot. Everything seemed ordinary again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease from the night before. My first task was the same as usual. Unlock the doors, check the thermostat, and make sure the shelves were tidy before the first visitors arrived. But as I reached for the logbook to sign in, I noticed something unusual. There was a note tucked inside, written in a precise, almost too perfect handwriting. Please ensure the back exit is locked before leaving at night. This is important. I frowned. The back exit was always locked automatically. It was part of the system. Still, I decided to check the door later just to make sure. I reminded myself that this was likely just a formality, but the phrasing of the note stuck with me. This is important. The words felt heavier than they needed to be. The morning passed without incident, busy enough to distract me for a while. Parents brought in children for story hour. Students wandered through, looking for books they'd procrastinated finding for their winter break assignments. By noon, the library hummed with quiet activity. It was comforting, in a way, to see the space full of life again. Then I saw Mr. Grayson. Mr. Grayson, the janitor, was an older man, gruff but kind in his way. I'd seen him countless times cleaning the floors or wiping down windows without a word. But today he seemed different. As I passed him in the hallway, he stopped abruptly, fixing me with a look I couldn't quite interpret. Make sure you follow the rules, he said, his voice low. I blinked. What rules? He hesitated, as though he wanted to say more but couldn't. Just the usual. Lock up properly. Don't stay late. You don't want to forget. Forget what? I asked, half laughing to mask my discomfort. He didn't answer. He simply nodded toward the back exit before walking away, his steps fading into the hallway. Later that day, I decided to take another look at the back exit. The note from the morning and Mr. Grayson's odd behavior had planted a seed of doubt that I couldn't ignore. The door was locked, as I'd expected, but I found myself lingering there, staring at the heavy metal frame. There was nothing unusual about it. No signs of tampering, no strange sounds. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt an inexplicable sense of unease. It was as if the door itself was waiting. Shaking off the thought, I double-checked the lock and returned to the front desk. As the day wore on, I started to notice other little things. Details I wouldn't usually think twice about, but now couldn't stop analyzing. For instance, the way some of the older staff spoke about the library, as though it were more than just a building. There's a history here, one of them had told me when I first started. It's got character. At the time, I'd thought they meant the creaky floors and the antique furniture. Now, I wasn't so sure. I also began to pay attention to the unwritten rules everyone seemed to follow, even though no one had ever formally explained them to me. Don't stay past 11 p.m. unless absolutely necessary. Always check the lights before locking up. The older wiring can be finicky. Make sure the upstairs archives are locked, even if no one has been up there all day. The more I thought about it, the more these rules seemed oddly specific. They were presented as practical guidelines, but the seriousness with which people followed them suggested something more. I started to wonder if there was a reason beyond mere practicality. That evening, as I prepared to leave, I found myself lingering again by the back exit. The carol from the night before was still on my mind. I half expected to hear it again as I locked the door, but the air outside was completely still. I glanced back at the library before heading to my car, and that's when I saw it. A light flickering in the upstairs archives. My stomach tightened. No one had been up there all day. I hesitated, debating whether to go back in. It's just the wiring, I told myself, but the thought wasn't convincing. When I finally got into my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something important. The next day, I decided to ask a coworker, Lisa, about the rules. She'd been working at the library for years and always seemed like the type who knew more than she let on. Do you ever feel like some of these rules are strange? I asked her casually as we sorted through a pile of returned books. She looked at me for a moment, her expression carefully neutral. What do you mean? Like the back exit thing? Or the archives? Do we really need to check them so often? Lisa hesitated, her hands pausing mid-motion. It's just how things are, she said finally. You don't want to mess with routine here. Why not? She opened her mouth to reply, then stopped. Instead, she gave me a tight smile. You'll understand eventually. That night, as I locked up the library, I couldn't stop thinking about her words. There was a weight to them, something unsaid that hung in the air like the faint scent of dust in the archives. I walked to the back exit one last time, checking the lock as always. But this time, I noticed something new. A faint scuff mark on the floor, as though someone had dragged their heel across the tiles. It led to the door and stopped abruptly, just like the footprints in the snow the night before. The air felt colder suddenly, the kind of cold that creeps in without warning. I shivered and stepped back, heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I thought I heard something, a faint hum, just like the night before. But when I strained to listen, the sound was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. The scuff marks near the back exit replayed in my mind like a puzzle I couldn't solve. It was such a small thing, really, but it lingered, twisting into something bigger the more I thought about it. And that faint hum, was it real? Or was my imagination working overtime? I kept telling myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew I didn't believe that. Something about the library felt wrong. Not in an obvious way, but in the way a crooked painting on the wall can throw off the whole room. By the time I returned to work the next day, my unease had grown into full-blown suspicion. I wasn't looking for anything unusual, not exactly, but I couldn't stop myself from noticing every little detail that didn't feel quite right. The first thing was the logbook. When I opened it to sign in, I noticed that someone had scribbled out their entry from the previous night. A name and a time, now nothing but a black smear of ink. Lisa, I called out as she walked by. Did you notice this? She glanced at the logbook, her expression unreadable. Happens sometimes, she said. People make mistakes. Doesn't it seem odd? She shrugged, but her movements were stiff, guarded. Maybe, or maybe you're just overthinking things. Later that morning, I decided to take another look at the upstairs archives. I'd been avoiding them since the flickering light the other night, but something kept pulling me back there. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed, the sound echoing in the empty hallway. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The air felt heavier up here, colder somehow. I reached for the key in my pocket, but as my hand brushed the doorknob, I froze. It was already unlocked. I was sure I'd locked it the night before. Positive. I pushed the door open slowly, half expecting to find someone inside. But the room was empty, just rows of shelves stacked with dusty books and old newspapers. The light was on, flickering faintly. I stepped inside, my breath visible in the frigid air. The room smelled different, mustier than usual, with a faint metallic tang that made my stomach turn. I walked the length of the shelves, my footsteps muffled by the thin carpet, but I didn't find anything out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to focus on my tasks, but my mind kept drifting back to the archives. Who had unlocked the door, and why? That evening, as I prepared to close up, I lingered by the back exit again. The scuff marks were still there, faint but undeniable. I crouched down for a closer look, running my fingers over the floor. The marks looked fresher now, as though someone had been there recently. The faint hum returned, so soft I wasn't sure if I was hearing it or imagining it. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. The sound wasn't coming from outside this time. It was coming from inside the library. I turned toward the stacks, the shadows between the shelves stretching long and dark. The hum grew louder, becoming a melody, a carol. I followed the sound, my steps hesitant but deliberate. It led me to the children's section, where the small reading chairs sat in a neat circle around a rug decorated with colorful animals. The sound stopped as soon as I entered. I looked around, scanning the rows of books and the empty chairs. There was nothing out of place, nothing that explained the music. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. By the time I locked up and left, I was thoroughly shaken. The night was cold and still, the snow crunching under my boots as I walked to my car. I didn't hear the carols again, but the quiet felt wrong, too perfect. When I got home, I tried to shake it off. I made tea, turned on the TV, and did my best to distract myself, but none of it worked. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flickering light in the archives, the scuff marks by the back exit, and the empty children's section where the music had stopped. Sleep didn't come easily that night. When it finally did, I dreamed of the library. I was back in the archives, but this time the door wouldn't open. I could hear the carols again, louder and clearer than before, but they weren't coming from outside. They were coming from behind the shelves. I woke up in a cold sweat, the melody still echoing in my mind. The next day, I arrived at the library early. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like I needed to be there to figure out what was happening. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt it again, that heaviness in the air, like the building itself was holding its breath. Lisa was already at the desk, her eyes darting up briefly as I walked in. "You're here early," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "Couldn't sleep," I replied, trying to sound casual. She didn't say anything, but the way she avoided my gaze told me she knew more than she was letting on. As the day went on, I started noticing more inconsistencies. A door that should have been locked was ajar. A book I distinctly remembered shelving was back on the cart. The logbook now had another entry scratched out, this time so heavily that the paper was torn. I tried to brush it off, to tell myself it was just my imagination. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more it felt like the library itself was pushing back, demanding my attention. By the time evening rolled around, I was dreading the thought of locking up. But as much as I wanted to leave early, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to stay, to see it through. The library had never felt so alive in its silence. Every shadow seemed to stretch farther than it should. Every creak of the wooden floors felt like a whisper from something unseen. By the time night fell, I could barely keep myself from jumping at every small sound. I'd planned to leave early, to lock up and put the strange events behind me, but something wouldn't let me. Or maybe I wouldn't let myself. Part of me needed to know what was happening here. Why did it feel like the library had suddenly started breathing? Lisa had left an hour earlier, offering me a brief, uneasy smile before disappearing into the cold night. "Be careful," she'd said, almost as an afterthought. I wasn't sure if she meant the icy roads or something else entirely. Now, alone in the dim light of the desk lamp, I sat staring at the logbook. Another name had been scratched out earlier in the day. I hadn't asked Lisa about it this time. I already knew she wouldn't give me a straight answer. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each second echoing louder in the stillness. It was nearing 11 p.m., the time everyone said you shouldn't stay past. I told myself I'd finish one last task and then head home. I stood and walked toward the back exit, my footsteps hesitant but steady. The scuff marks on the floor were still there, more pronounced now as though someone had traced over them. I checked the lock, it was secure. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, just beyond the edge of my vision. As I turned to head back to the front desk, I froze. The faint sound of a carol drifted through the air, soft and distant. Silent night. My chest tightened. It was the same melody I'd heard 2 nights ago, the same hauntingly slow tune. Only this time, it didn't seem to be coming from outside. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. It led me to the children's section again, where the small chairs sat in their familiar circle. The melody grew louder as I approached, and I could feel the air grow colder with every step. When I reached the edge of the circle, the music stopped. Silence fell, heavy and oppressive. I looked around, scanning the rows of shelves, but there was no one there. That's when I saw it. One of the chairs wasn't empty anymore. Sitting there, perfectly still, was a small, stuffed bear. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. The little thing was worn, its fur matted and one of its eyes missing, but it was unmistakably there. I stared at it, my mind racing. Who had put it there? And how? I backed away, the hair on my arms standing on end. I didn't hear the footsteps until I was halfway to the front desk. They were faint, but distinct, soft, deliberate, and coming from the direction I had just left. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. The children's section was empty, just as I'd left it. The stuffed bear sat in its chair, as motionless as before. "Hello!" My voice barely carried, trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. The footsteps stopped. I didn't run, though every instinct screamed at me to do so. Instead, I forced myself to move slowly, deliberately, back toward the front desk. If I could just lock up and leave, I told myself, everything would be fine. But when I reached the desk, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The logbook was open, even though I'd left it closed. A new name had been written at the bottom of the page in the same sharp, precise handwriting as the note I'd found earlier in the week. 11:15 p.m., locked the back exit. Everything is in place. My heart raced as I stared at the entry. The ink was still wet. I turned to grab my keys, but they weren't where I'd left them. The desk drawer was slightly open, its contents scattered as though someone had been rummaging through it. The lights flickered, plunging the library into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the air felt different, thicker, heavier, like the space itself had shifted. I decided to check the archives one last time. Maybe it was irrational, but I couldn't leave without knowing if something or someone was up there. The stairs creaked louder this time, the sound echoing like gunshots in the empty building. When I reached the door, it was already ajar, swinging gently as though it had been pushed just moments before. I stepped inside, my hands trembling. The room was colder than I remembered, and the metallic smell from before was stronger now, almost suffocating. I moved slowly through the rows of shelves, my footsteps muffled by the thin carpet. At first, everything seemed normal, but then I noticed it, the stuffed bear. It was sitting on the floor in the far corner of the room, its single eye staring at me. I froze, a chill running down my spine. The bear hadn't been there before, couldn't have been. I reached out, hesitant, and picked it up. The fur was rough and damp, as though it had been left outside in the snow. I turned it over in my hands, my mind racing with questions. That's when the door slammed shut. The sound was deafening in the small room, reverberating through the air. I dropped the bear, spinning around to face the door. It was locked. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking, and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light illuminated the shelves, the floor, and finally the door. There was no one there, no shadow, no movement. But then I heard it again, the carol. Silent Night. This time it wasn't distant. It was right behind me. I turned slowly, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The shelves were empty, just rows of books and dust. But the melody didn't stop. It grew louder, filling the room, until it was all I could hear. I don't remember running. All I know is that somehow I made it back to the front desk. The logbook was still open, the new entry staring back at me like a taunt. I grabbed my bag and ran out the door, leaving the library behind. The snow crunched under my boots as I reached my car, my breath visible in the freezing air. I didn't look back. I didn't go back to the library the next day, or the day after that. I called Lisa and told her I was sick, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't press for details, and I was grateful for it. I didn't know how to explain what had happened, and even if I tried, I wasn't sure I'd believe it myself. The days blurred together after that. I spent most of my time at home, curtains drawn, the soft glow of the TV filling the room. But even then, the silence felt heavy. Too heavy. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the wind outside my window, it all sounded wrong. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was all in my head. The bear, the door, the carols, they were just coincidences. They had to be. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. A week later, Lisa called me. "Are you coming back?" she asked, her tone light but cautious. I hesitated. I don't think so. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "You're not the first, you know. People leave. They don't always say why, but I can guess." "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach twisting. Another pause. The library's old. It has its quirks. Not everyone can handle them. Quirks. That's what she called them. Like the scuff marks on the floor, the logbook entries, the bear, the music. Like all of that could be written off as just some harmless oddities. I didn't push her for more. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it anyway. Even though I never went back, the library stayed with me. Little things would remind me of it. A faint melody on the radio, the sound of snow crunching underfoot, the flicker of a light bulb. And every time, I'd feel that same cold weight settle over me, like a shadow passing too close. I tried to tell myself it was just a bad experience, something I'd eventually move past. But late at night, when the world was quiet, I'd hear it again. The carol, soft and distant, like it was coming from just outside my window. One night, months later, I finally worked up the courage to look. The street was empty just like before. No footprints in the snow. No glowing lights. Nothing. But the music didn't stop. It grew louder, clearer, until I was sure it wasn't just in my head. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring into the dark, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The music just stopped as suddenly as it had started. I went back inside, locking the door behind me with trembling hands. I still think about the library sometimes, about the archives, the bear, the scuff marks on the floor. I think about Lisa's words, the way she seemed to know something but wouldn't say it. And I wonder if I should have stayed, if I should have tried harder to understand what was happening. But then I remember the sound of that door slamming shut, the weight of the silence that followed, and I know I made the right choice. Now, whenever I hear a Christmas carol, my breath catches, just for a second. It doesn't matter where I am, at a store, in my car, even at home. For that moment, I'm back in the library, standing in the archives, with the air so cold it burns my lungs. Most days I can shake it off. I tell myself it's just a memory, that it can't hurt me anymore. But every once in a while, I feel that same heaviness in the air, that same weight pressing down on me. And I wonder, what if it's not over? Subscribe for more horror stories every day.